In just 42 minutes, an 18-year-old black boy left the entire courtroom, including the notoriously harsh white judge, frozen in silence. In a trial filled with prejudice, the truth slowly began to unfold, but what he said in the end made everyone cry. What exactly happened in those 42 minutes? The morning in Silver County dawned under a sprawling gray sky, the air biting cold as it slipped through every crack and crevice, casting an indescribable heaviness over the courthouse. No wind stirred, no bird sang. Everything seemed locked in a frozen, invisible limbo. Inside courtroom number 3 of the county courthouse, the atmosphere was stifling, almost unbearable. The beige walls, faded and dull, reflected the harsh, sterile glow of ancient fluorescent bulbs, making the space feel more like a frigid clinic than a hall of justice. The hard wooden benches creaked under the slightest shift, though no one dared move more than necessary. The air hung thick and oppressive, as if someone had sealed the doors and bolted shut any chance of breathing freely. The jury sat in a rigid line, backs straight like statues, their eyes silent and icy. A handful of locals crammed into the back rows, their faces alight with a morbid curiosity, here for a spectacle, not a criminal trial. Reporters hunched over their notepads, scribbling furiously, but their glances darted around the room with a calculating edge. They weren't after truth. They were hunting a headline that would sell. Up on the bench, Judge Loretta Hayes hadn't yet spoken, but her presence radiated an arrogant authority. Her sharp, blade-like gaze swept over the room, sizing up each person with a single, piercing look. No one here seemed inclined to listen. They'd already made up their minds, and the one who'd bear the weight of their prejudgment was the black sun about to step through that cold, unforgiving door. The courtroom door groaned open with a long, chilling screech that seemed to scrape up from the depths of every listener's chest. All eyes swiveled toward it, no one prompting, no one needing to, an unspoken anticipation laced with a deep, simmering contempt. And then he stepped in, Malik Carter, 18, black, lanky, and thin. His dark skin stood out starkly against the sickly white glow of the fluorescent lights overhead. He wore a faded, ill-fitting suit, baggy and rumpled, clearly handed down through too many owners. The shoulders sagged, the pant legs swallowed his worn-out shoes, as if the outfit had been scavenged from someone else's cast-offs rather than chosen for a day in court. He moved slowly, each step gliding across the frigid wooden floor. In his hands, he clutched a thick stack of papers, edges curled, littered with a chaotic mess of multicolored sticky notes, a desperate, obvious effort by someone who'd pored over them hundreds of times until they frayed. Malik's face betrayed no clear emotion, no fear, no defiance, just a taut, suppressed tension. His eyes tilted downward, not evading but not challenging either. It was the look of someone who knew he was stepping into a place that didn't want him to exist. Then a low chuckle broke the silence. A silver-haired man in the back, arms crossed with smug satisfaction, leaned over and muttered just loud enough to be heard. "He's his own lawyer, huh?" The laughter that followed spread like a reflex, never loud but the snickering, mocking kind that made the air even heavier. A middle-aged woman nodded in agreement. Another kid who thinks he's smarter than a real attorney. A guy in a gray shirt clapped his buddy's shoulder. "Give him 15 minutes before he crashes and burns." At the prosecution table, Edwin Blake, the sharp-eyed prosecutor, let a faint smirk tug at his lips. He didn't need to say a word. To him, this trial was over before it even started. Malik heard it all, but didn't react. Not a glance, not a sigh. He just tightened his grip on the stack of papers, a small, subtle clench, as if clinging to the last shred of faith he had left. He walked to the defendant's table, no one guiding him, no one rising to offer a seat. His footsteps echoed alone in a room packed with bodies but devoid of humanity. When he sat, one juror even turned away, shaking their head as if unwilling to waste another second looking at him. He set the papers down on the table carefully, opening the stack and arranging each page like it was the most precious thing he owned. And in that moment, amid the jeers and dismissive stares, something tiny but quiet shifted in the room. Malik didn't bow his head out of fear, he bowed it to focus. That calm resolve made a few people falter, if only for a split second, not because they believed in him, but because they suddenly wondered, maybe, they'd misjudged something. Of course, no one admitted it. They just sat back, waiting to watch him fall, convinced it would happen any minute now. From her towering bench, Judge Loretta Hayes slid her glasses up the bridge of her nose with a deliberate flick. Her seasoned eyes, cold as winter steel, swept the courtroom in a slow, predatory arc before locking onto the scrawny teenager sitting alone at the defendant's table. She let the silence stretch, a calculated pause that piled tension onto the moment, each second a brick in the wall of judgment she was about to lay down. When her voice finally cut through, it was measured, crisp, but dripping with a sarcasm so sharp it could draw blood. "Mr. Carter, I understand you've elected to represent yourself. A fascinating choice." She lingered on that pause, her gaze slicing through Malik like a scalpel, then darting to the jury with a theatrical flourish, as if inviting them to join her in marveling at the sheer audacity of the spectacle. "Do you genuinely believe," she continued, her tone steady but laced with venomous mockery, "that a child like you, barely out of high school, can stand toe-to-toe with a legal system that's weathered centuries? Let me be clear. This isn't some civics classroom where you can charm your way through a half-baked speech." She leaned forward slightly, her glasses glinting under the harsh lights, her words growing heavier with every syllable. "This is a federal courtroom, Mr. Carter, a place where every utterance carries the full force of the law, where a single stumble, a single misplaced breath, can chain you to a fate you can't undo. Do you comprehend the gravity of what you've walked into? Or are you just too naive to see the cliff you're teetering on?" A few in the room bit back grins, their lips twitching with suppressed amusement, but the murmurs swelled like a rising tide. An old man in the front row, his face creased with years, leaned over with a conspiratorial whisper. "There it is. She's schooling him already." A woman in a stiff blazer shook her head, her voice low but biting. "Confidence is cute until it lands you in a cell for a decade." A younger guy in a gray shirt snorted, elbowing his friend. 15 minutes, I'm calling it. He'll be begging for a lawyer before the clock hits noon." Across the room, Edwin Blake lounged at the prosecution table, his sharp features alight with a smug glee he didn't bother to conceal. He tipped his head in a subtle nod, like a hunter watching prey stumble into a trap already sprung. Malik sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the judge, his expression a blank slate carved from stone. But beneath the table, hidden from view, his hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles blanched, the skin stretched taut over bone. He wasn't some wide-eyed kid oblivious to the game. They were stacking the deck against him, brick by brick, and he knew it. But he wasn't the type to let their honey-dipped barbs shatter him either. He drew a slow, deliberate breath through his nose, the air hissing faintly as it filled his lungs, and gave a single, curt nod. No groveling apology, no frantic defense, just that quiet, stubborn gesture, a refusal to bend under their weight. The silence that settled back over the room wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the sterile calm of the trial's opening moments. It was dense, suffocating, a pressure that bore down on every shoulder and tightened every chest. In that thick stillness, an unspoken truth pulsed through the space. Malik Carter hadn't come here to win their approval or soothe their egos. He wasn't here to dance for their amusement or grovel at their feet. He was here for something else, something they couldn't quite name. And that, for a room full of people steeped in absolute power, accustomed to obedience and deference, was an affront they couldn't stomach. It gnawed at them, a splinter under their skin. Because deep down, beneath their smirks and certainty, they sensed it. This kid wasn't just a lamb to the slaughter. And that alone made their blood simmer. Malik rose slowly, the wooden chair scraping against the floor with a harsh, dry creak as he pushed it back. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, not out of anticipation for something extraordinary, but an eager wait for a stumble, a fumble, some flicker of childish awkwardness that would cement their unshakable belief. This boy was digging his own grave. Yet Malik didn't tremble. He didn't snap back at the judge's biting sarcasm or cast a fleeting glance toward the snickering onlookers. He simply stood, his spine straight as a rod, hands resting on the table as if anchoring himself against an unseen tempest roaring beneath the surface. His gaze lifted steadily to the judge's bench, unwavering, unblinking. There was no defiance in his eyes, but no submission either. It was the stare of someone acutely aware of the perilous ground he stood on, yet who had chosen to step onto it with purpose, a quiet, weighty look that seemed to whisper, "I know you don't believe in me, but I'm going forward anyway." The faint hiss of his breathing crackled through the courtroom's microphone, each inhale and exhale sharp and distinct, like a metronome ticking out the storm raging within. For that brief moment, every peripheral sound blurred into irrelevance. The jeers, the whispers, the rustle of papers fading into a distant hum. Those mocking words from moments ago shrank, reduced to feeble ripples lapping against the hull of an unyielding ship. Malik wasn't some lost teenager stumbling into an adult world. He was a young man who'd walked in armed with a burden forged through sleepless nights, pieced together from dog-eared law books borrowed from a community library, honed by hours of rehearsing arguments in front of a cracked mirror with a heart pounding like a war drum. No one in that room could have guessed that over the next 42 minutes, this very boy would silence them all. But at this precise moment, they still didn't believe. And that was exactly Malik's silence unsettled them. A few shifted in their seats, their smirks faltering ever so slightly, not because of anything he'd said, but because he hadn't said anything at all. That stillness, that unshakable calm, carried a menace far more potent than any desperate plea or fiery retort. It hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unspoken. And for the first time, a sliver of unease crept into the hearts of those who'd been so certain of his downfall. The air in the courtroom remained thick, a suffocating blend of curiosity and contempt hanging over every held breath. After a few tense minutes ticked by, Judge Loretta Hayes gave a curt nod toward the prosecution. Edwin Blake rose with a predator's grace, stepping into the center of the room. His voice rang out clear and cold, honed to perfection by hundreds of victorious trials, dripping with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Your Honor, the prosecution calls its first witness, Officer Raymond Knox, the arresting officer at the scene. A side door creaked open, and a man in a crisp police uniform strode in. Raymond Knox embodied the kind of authority that didn't need to shout to be felt. Broad-shouldered, high and tight haircut, eyes like forged steel, and a voice as unyielding as granite. He marched to the witness stand, swearing his oath in a gravelly, resolute tone, then settled into the chair with the stern, practiced demeanor of someone accustomed to wielding power over others. Blake approached, hands clasped in front of him, launching into his questioning with the smooth ease of a well-rehearsed script. Officer Knox, please recount the events of the night of March 14th in the West Silver County residential area. Knox nodded, his gaze sweeping the room once, a silent assertion of dominance, before launching into his testimony with a steady, deliberate cadence heavy with accusatory weight. At approximately 10:15 p.m., I was on patrol when I received a 911 dispatch about a suspicious vehicle reported stolen, a black sedan parked on the roadside. Upon arriving at the scene, I observed the defendant, Malik Carter, hunched over the dashboard. He was holding what appeared to be a screwdriver, seemingly attempting to hotwire the ignition. I immediately shouted, "Police, stop right there." But instead of complying, he bolted. I pursued him for about 70 meters and subdued him shortly after. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery, this time tinged with judgment and a grim satisfaction that confirmed their biases. A black kid, late at night, hunched over a reported stolen car with a tool in hand. The story painted a picture so neatly damning that it felt like justice was already marching to its rightful conclusion. One juror, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow, arched an eyebrow at Malik, as if the case had just clicked shut in his mind. Malik sat still, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't glance at Officer Knox, didn't flinch at each pointed accusation the way an innocent person might. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, scribbling something in a worn notebook, his eyes narrowing with a fierce focus, as if every word Knox uttered was a piece of a larger puzzle only he could see taking shape. No one noticed that from the moment Knox took the stand, Malik's breathing had slowed, deepened, a deliberate rhythm cutting through the chaos. He wasn't swept up in anger or panic. He was waiting because he knew when his turn came, a single, well-placed question could start unraveling it all. But right now, no one else did. To them, Knox's testimony was a gavel strike, enough to brand Malik a criminal before the debate even began. And that unspoken injustice, the ease with which they swallowed a uniformed man's word as gospel, only thickened the air, making it harder to breathe, heavier with the weight of what was left unsaid. Judge Hayes tilted her head slightly, her fingers tapping the bench with the handle of her gavel in a soft, rhythmic patter. Her gaze locked on Malik, as if sizing up whether he had the nerve to push back. No one in the room genuinely expected anything remarkable. To them, Malik's self-defense was a fleeting drizzle in a drought, brief, misplaced, and destined to evaporate, leaving behind nothing but a ridiculous, muddy puddle. Yet Malik held his composure, an island of calm amid their storm of skepticism. He rose to his feet, the chair scraping faintly against the floor, and plucked a single sheet from his weathered stack of papers. Then he stepped toward the witness stand, his movements slow and deliberate, each footfall a quiet defiance against the weight pressing down on him. His voice broke the silence, not loud but crisp and steady, each word shaped with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed it dozens of times in front of a cracked mirror. "Officer Knox, I'd like permission to ask a few questions." Knox gave a curt nod, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of impatience, the kind of assent from someone thinking, "Go ahead, kid, make a fool of yourself." Malik didn't waste a second. He met Knox's gaze head-on and asked, his tone even and unshaken, "You said you saw me hot-wiring the car. How far away were you when you observed this?" Knox frowned, caught off guard by the question's lack of aggression. "About 20 feet, he replied, his voice hitching slightly, as if he were mentally double-checking the distance. Malik nodded, repeating it with quiet intent. "About 20 feet. It was a simple echo, but it felt like the first stone laid in a foundation for something larger. "And what time was this?" Malik pressed. "Around 10:15 p.m., Knox answered, his tone still firm but less certain now. Malik didn't miss a beat. "So, tell me," he continued, "was it bright out at that time?" Knox's brow furrowed deeper, a trace of irritation creeping in. "No, it was pretty dark, just a couple of dim streetlights at the corner." Malik let the words hang there, pausing for a few deliberate seconds, just long enough for the room to feel a subtle shift, like the faint pluck of an unfamiliar string in a symphony they'd all grown too comfortable with. He glanced briefly at Judge Hayes, then turned his steady gaze back to Knox. "So," he said, his voice slowing, each syllable measured and deliberate, "you were over 6 meters away from me, in low-light conditions, at night, and you're absolutely certain I was hot-wiring the car?" Knox didn't respond immediately. A tiny silence stretched out, not long but sharp and heavy, a crack in the seamless narrative. It was enough to make heads lift in the gallery. A woman paused her scribbling, her pen hovering as she looked up. At the prosecution table, Edwin Blake leaned forward ever so slightly, his smirk faltering. Malik stood there, still and silent, not pressing, not gloating, just waiting. And in a courtroom that had pegged him as a punchline from the start, that fleeting moment when Knox hesitated was the first fracture, a hairline crack barely visible. But to anyone paying attention, it was clear, the wall had started to tremble. Malik, barely a step into his cross-examination, had forced the room to hold its breath, if only for a heartbeat. The air thickened further, the weight of unspoken doubt seeping into the crevices of their certainty. And for the first time, the possibility flickered. Maybe this wasn't going to play out the way they scripted it. Malik didn't leap to his feet or betray even a hint of eagerness as Officer Knox's testimony hung in the air, its weight teetering on the edge of scrutiny. Instead, he moved with a deliberate, almost agonizing slowness. The wooden chair beneath him groaned with a dry, rasping creak as he pushed it back. The sound cut through the courtroom like a blade, amplifying the tension that already coiled tight around every soul present. The room didn't breathe, not out of awe or expectation, but in a predatory stillness, a collective hunger for the misstep they were certain would come. They waited for the crack in his armor, the stumble, the nervous stammer that would affirm their unshakable conviction. This boy was burying himself alive. Yet Malik stood steady, unshaken. He didn't fire back at the judge's venomous sarcasm or flick his gaze toward the gallery's chorus of snickers. He rose, his spine rigid as iron, hands pressing against the table's edge as if to anchor himself against the invisible storm surging beneath his calm exterior. His eyes lifted, locking onto the judge's bench with a focus so piercing it seemed to carve through the haze of disdain filling the room. There was no defiance in that stare, no brash challenge flashing like a dare, but neither was there surrender. It was the look of someone who knew the ground beneath him was a tightrope strung over a chasm, yet who'd chosen to walk with eyes wide open, a quiet, resolute gaze that carried an unspoken vow. "I know you've already judged me. I know you think I'm done. But I'm here, and I'm not backing down. The courtroom microphone caught the faint rhythm of his breathing, slow, deliberate inhales that rasped softly through the speakers, each one a testament to the storm he held at bay within. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to shrink to that sound alone. The jeers, the rustling papers, the creak of shifting bodies all faded into a muted blur, drowned by the gravity of Malik's silence. He bent over his battered stack of papers, fingers tracing the edges as he flipped through them with a precision that spoke of countless sleepless nights. The pages were a mess, worn and curling at the corners, plastered with a chaotic patchwork of multicolored sticky notes, some peeling, some smudged with ink from relentless handling. It was the arsenal of a desperate mind, forged through hours hunched over borrowed law books, fueled by a fire no one else could see. From that frayed pile, he drew a single-color photograph, its corner marked with a bold, meticulous stroke of red pen, a beacon in the chaos. The room froze. The faint whir of the ceiling fan overhead became a deafening roar in the vacuum of sound, its blades slicing through the silence with mechanical indifference. Every eye tracked Malik's slow, deliberate steps as he approached the judge's bench, his movements pulling the courtroom into a surreal, suspended moment where time itself seemed to falter. The air thickened, pressing against every chest, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness what came next. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low and steady, reverberating with a control that belied his 18 years. "I request permission to present visual evidence." He raised the photograph high, holding it steady for Judge Hayes to absorb its details, then pivoted with a measured turn to face the jury. The image captured the interior of the car in question, the so-called stolen sedan. Its dashboard gleamed under the morning light, pristine and untouched. No wires dangled, no panels hung loose, no signs of the frantic tampering Knox had described. Malik's hand moved with surgical precision, pointing to the center of the console, his tone hardening from a question into a declaration, forging certainty. "This photograph was taken inside the vehicle the morning after the alleged incident," he began, his words slicing through the stillness like a whip crack. "The wiring is fully encased within the dashboard, intact, concealed, inaccessible. You'd need to rip the entire panel apart to even glimpse it. There's no way, no possible way, it could be visible from outside the car, in the dead of night, from over 6 meters away, under dim streetlights and shadows." The silence that followed was suffocating, a void so deep it swallowed every whisper, every rustle. The truth landed like a thunderclap, raw, unassailable, and utterly unexpected from the boy they dismissed as a fool stumbling into his own doom. It wasn't just the evidence, it was the way Malik delivered it, with a clarity and poise that left no room for evasion, no crevice for doubt to hide. The photograph wasn't merely a picture. It was a guillotine poised to sever the flimsy threads of the prosecution's narrative. The jury stirred, their rigid facade fracturing. A woman in the front row pressed a trembling hand to her lips, stifling a gasp that threatened to break free. An older man, his face etched with years, hunched over his notepad, scribbling furiously with a hand that shook, not from age but from the jolt of what he'd just seen. In the gallery, a pen clattered to the floor, the sound ricocheting through the stillness like a gunshot, a stark punctuation to the unraveling scene. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a few breaths caught audibly in throats as the weight of Malik's move sank in. And then there was Judge Loretta Hayes, the woman who'd presided over this trial with an air of detached superiority, who'd scribbled notes with a bored flourish or cast dismissive glances like a queen surveying her court. Now she lifted her head fully, for the first time since the gavel had struck, her piercing gaze fixed on Malik, not with the scorn that had been her shield, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity that flickered in her steely eyes. Her glasses slipped a fraction down her nose, but she made no move to adjust them, her attention riveted, her posture stiffening as if she'd been jolted awake. It was the first crack in her armor, a hairline fracture in the wall of authority she'd built around herself. That moment hung in the air like the faint, ominous snap of glass under pressure, a mirror everyone had assumed impervious now spiderwebbed with the first signs of ruin. It didn't shatter outright, not yet, but the sound echoed in every mind. Something was breaking, and what rattled them most wasn't just the evidence. It was the boy wielding it, the kid they'd mocked, the one they'd pegged as a lamb led to slaughter, had stepped forward and swung the first blow against their fortress of certainty. He didn't do it with a scream of rage or a flood of tears. He did it with a single photograph, a quiet voice, and a truth so stark, so cold, so irrefutable that it froze the room in its tracks, leaving a shiver of doubt in its wake. No one spoke. No one dared. The jury exchanged furtive glances, their once steady hands now fidgeting with pens or smoothing wrinkled papers. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, a restless murmur threatening to rise, but stifled by the sheer force of what they'd witnessed. Even Edwin Blake, the prosecutor with the predator's smirk, faltered for a fraction of a second, his fingers tightening around his notes, his jaw clenching as the ground beneath his case trembled. They'd come to watch a boy fall, to revel in his collapse. Instead, they were staring at the first fracture in a wall they'd thought impregnable. And it was Malik Carter, alone and underestimated, who'd struck the blow. Malik returned to his seat with a measured pace, neither rushed nor arrogant. He set the photograph back on the table, then lifted his head to face the witness stand, where Officer Knox sat frozen, as if the mask of authority he'd worn so confidently had just been ripped away. Malik's eyes no longer carried the strain of a teenager struggling to hold his own. They burned with the quiet certainty of someone who knew he'd just shaken the very foundation of the trial. The room plunged into a silence so dense, so suffocating, that the faint thump of heartbeats seemed to echo in the stillness. Turning to face the jury, Malik spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but each word sliced through the fog of doubt still clinging to the case like a sharpened blade. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if the initial testimony is impossible, if an officer claims to have witnessed a crime from over 6 meters away, in the dark, from outside a car whose interior design makes that observation implausible, then the entire starting accusation of this case should be called into question. A long, shaky breath escaped from somewhere in the back. The snickers had vanished. The whispers died out. Even Edwin Blake, the prosecutor who'd always carried himself with an air of unshakable superiority, couldn't mask his unease. His fingers tightened around his pen, a reflex, as if itching to counterattack, but no opening presented itself, no crack he could exploit. Up on the bench, Judge Hayes leaned forward, elbows propped on the table, hands clasped tightly. She stared at Malik, her expression unreadable. No one could guess her thoughts, but that gaze wasn't the detached, commanding look of a judge presiding from on high. It was the look of someone, perhaps for the first time, truly listening. The atmosphere compressed, sinking to a suffocating depth. No outbursts erupted, no rebuttal rang out. Only a chilling silence remained, the kind that seeps into your bones, a silence born from a room grappling with the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong. Wrong from the start. Wrong for placing blind faith in the word of a uniformed figure without ever pausing to ask if it even made sense. And in that stillness, the image of Malik Carter, the boy they'd mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, shifted. He was no longer just a lone kid against the world. He became an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit the script they'd all rehearsed in their minds. And that misalignment sent a tremor through the system, a faint, undeniable shudder of uncertainty. The tension in the courtroom hadn't even begun to dissipate after the electrifying clash between Malik and Officer Knox. But before the jury could fully process the cracks that had started to form in the prosecution's narrative, Edwin Blake was already on his feet, unwilling to let doubt take root. He straightened his tie with a swift, practiced motion, masking any trace of unease beneath the icy veneer he perfected over hundreds of trials. He needed to wrest back control, and he knew exactly how to do it. Summon a witness who could shift the jury's focus from skepticism to guilt. Your Honor, Blake announced, his voice cutting through the charged silence. The prosecution calls its next witness, Mrs. Caroline Whitaker, the owner of the allegedly stolen vehicle. The side door swung open, and a white woman in her mid-50s stepped into the room, her demeanor stern and her posture rigid. She wore a beige overcoat buttoned up to the collar, its high neckline a shield against vulnerability. Her face was a mask of stoicism, save for the faintly reddened eyes that suggested sleepless nights or perhaps a calculated effort to appear so. As she took her place at the witness stand and swore her oath, the courtroom felt deathly quiet. Malik lifted his gaze to meet hers, not with hostility, but with razor-sharp focus. He knew she was the next critical link in the chain he'd have to dismantle, piece by painstaking piece. Blake approached her, his tone softening abruptly into something almost tender, a practiced empathy that felt rehearsed yet effective. "Mrs. Whitaker, please tell us what happened." She drew a deep, shuddering breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and began speaking in a steady voice tinged with a faint tremble. I parked my car in front of my house, like I do every night. It's a black sedan, fairly new, just paid off not long ago. I distinctly remember locking the doors. The next morning, when I went out to head to work, I stepped outside, and it was gone. I panicked. My legs felt like they couldn't hold me up. I called the police right away. Blake nodded, his eyes drifting toward the jury with a subtle, masterful display of compassion. The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. The earlier snickers and smirks evaporated, replaced by a somber weight. Gone was the mockery, the casual disdain. In its place stood the image of a middle-aged woman, respectable, earnest, recounting her loss with a raw sincerity that seemed to resonate. The jury's faces softened, a few heads tilted in quiet sympathy. Their gazes flickered toward Malik, as if weighing whether his cleverness could erase the pain of a woman robbed of her hard-earned property. Malik remained still, his hands resting on his stack of papers, his eyes locked on Caroline Whitaker's every-minute gesture. He knew her words rang true, or at least part of them did. But what gripped him more fiercely was what she didn't say. The room tilted toward her testimony, the jury visibly swayed by her quiet distress. Some nodded faintly, others cast sidelong glances at Malik, their expressions now tinged with a mix of pity and accusation, as if wondering how he could justify this. Yet Malik showed no sign of faltering. He understood that the real crux of the matter hadn't surfaced yet. He was waiting, biding his time for the precise moment to steer everything back to its raw, unvarnished truth. Because he knew sometimes empathy could be a tool wielded to mislead, if no one dared to ask the right questions. And Malik was ready to ask them. Malik rose from his seat as the prosecutor retreated from the witness stand, his movements unhurried and devoid of triumph or confrontation. Each step he took retained that quiet, unshakable calm, a stillness so profound it seemed to pull the room's frenetic energy down a notch, forcing it to match his rhythm. He approached the witness stand, stopping at the precise distance protocol demanded, his gaze not interrogative but patient, like someone methodically searching for the hairline fracture in a wall that seemed to all eyes unbreakable. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," Malik began, his voice soft yet razor-sharp, cutting cleanly through the expectant hush of the courtroom. "May I ask, at the time you discovered your car was missing, did you personally see anyone take it?" Caroline faltered for a split second, as if the simplicity of the question caught her off guard. "No," she replied, her tone clipped. "I was asleep. When I woke up, it was gone." Malik nodded, his face impassive. He pressed on, his voice dipping lower now, each word deliberate and precise, like a needle threading through the seams of her testimony. "So, you didn't actually see anyone steal the car?" "No." "Did you notice any strangers lingering around your house that night?" "No." "Any unusual sounds? Shattering glass? A car alarm? Anything at all in the night?" She shook her head, her lips tightening slightly. "No, nothing. I sleep pretty soundly." Malik tilted his body just enough to retrieve a forensic report from his stack of papers, holding it up briefly before continuing. "Mrs. Whitaker, when the police recovered the car, were there any signs of forced entry? Picked locks? Broken windows?" Caroline's brow furrowed, her hesitation more pronounced now, as if she were sifting through her memory for a safe answer. "No," she admitted. "Everything was intact. No damage." Malik paused, letting the silence stretch for a few deliberate seconds. The stillness in the courtroom swelled again, but this time it carried a different hue: confusion. The jury exchanged fleeting glances, some tilting their heads as if a puzzle piece had slipped out of place. At the prosecution table, Edwin Blake's hand tightened into a subtle fist, his eyes flickering with the first hint of unease. Malik turned to face the jury directly, his eyes glinting with an odd, quiet intensity. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His words carried effortlessly across the room. The car wasn't forced open. No locks were tampered with. No windows smashed. No strange noises woke Mrs. Whitaker. No one saw anything. So, if the car wasn't broken into, if there's no evidence of a forced entry, then the question becomes, how did someone take it? A few jurors scribbled hastily in their notepads. A faint murmur stirred from the gallery, only to be swallowed by the mounting tension that now gripped the room like a vice. Malik didn't point fingers or leap to conclusions. He didn't have to. He'd planted a seed, a single legitimate question, and let the silence nurture it into a doubt too glaring to ignore. That unspoken uncertainty hung heavy, rippling through the courtroom, its impact more devastating than any direct accusation could have been. The atmosphere in the courtroom still buzzed with restless energy after Malik's piercing line of questioning, the air too charged to settle. The jury shifted noticeably, a few whispering among themselves, their pens scratching against notepads in uneven bursts. Edwin Blake fought to maintain his composed facade, but his knuckles whitened as they gripped the edge of his table, betraying the strain beneath his polished exterior. Malik stood before the witness stand, his eyes sweeping the room with a quiet intensity, as if weighing a daring gambit. Then he turned to Judge Loretta Hayes, his gaze steady, unflinching. "Your Honor," Malik said, his voice ringing clear, "I'd like to call a witness who I believe will provide critical insight into this case. Mr. Gerald Whitaker." A ripple of surprise coursed through the room, soft but undeniable. Head swiveled. Caroline Whitaker's brow furrowed, her mouth parting as if to protest, only to freeze mid-motion, her expression morphing from confusion to a sharp, guarded weariness. The door creaked open. A middle-aged man shuffled in, his gray shirt wrinkled, his stocky frame slightly hunched, his salt and pepper hair thinning at the crown. Gerald Whitaker, Caroline's husband, moved toward the witness stand with heavy, reluctant steps, his face etched with unease, as though he knew his presence was an unwelcome intrusion. After swearing his oath, he sat, his hands fidgeting briefly before settling in his lap. Malik approached, maintaining a respectful distance, his tone shifting, not the cutting edge he'd used with Officer Knox, but something gentler, almost like he was offering an escape route Gerald hadn't yet realized existed. "Mr. Whitaker," Malik began, "do you own the black sedan, license plate 337 to 237? "Yes," Gerald replied, his voice rough, his eyes darting briefly toward his wife, who sat rigid as stone. "Did you ever lend that car to anyone? On the night of the incident?" A suffocating silence descended. Gerald hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. The pause stretched, heavy and taut, long enough for everyone to sense that whatever came next wouldn't be simple. Malik didn't press, didn't interrupt. He stood still, patient, letting the weight of the moment do its work. Gerald's voice faltered. Then he exhaled sharply, as if shoving off a burden that had crushed him too long. "I let my nephew, Jordan, borrow the car that night. He said he needed it to visit his girlfriend. I didn't think to tell my wife." A stunned murmur erupted from the gallery, a low roar of disbelief cut short by the sharp bark of the bailiff demanding silence. Caroline whipped around to face her husband, her eyes wide and blazing, a furious red creeping into her cheeks. No one could tell if her shock stemmed from betrayal or from genuine ignorance of the truth. Edwin Blake shot to his feet, his files slamming shut with a chaotic rustle, his face flushing with a mix of surprise and barely contained fury. Malik stood motionless, his expression unchanged, though his next breath came a fraction deeper. He'd known, and now everyone else in the room did too. A single revelation had detonated an explosive truth. The car wasn't stolen. It had been lent out willingly, without a hint of criminal intent. Gerald's silence, Caroline's omission, the police's haste, and the prosecution's rush to judgment had woven together a false narrative, dramatic and compelling but utterly detached from reality. With one testimony, one buried fact laid bare, the towering edifice of accusation the system had built over days began to fracture from within, cracks spiderwebbing through its foundation. The moment Gerald Whitaker's testimony landed, a seismic shock wave tore through the courtroom, a silent explosion that reverberated in every corner. Gone were the scattered whispers. Now a unified gasp, a collective "oh," erupted from the gallery. The jury, even the reporters, whose frantic typing halted as their eyes widened in disbelief. No one could have predicted that a single, fleeting sentence could flip the entire case on its head with such devastating speed. Caroline Whitaker sat frozen, her gaze locked on her husband, her face drained to a ghostly white, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles straining against her skin. She didn't scream, she didn't react, but her eyes, hollow, betrayed adrift, spoke volumes. A silent scream louder than any outburst. Meanwhile, Edwin Blake, the unshakable pillar of prosecutorial might, faltered. His face flushed crimson, a twitch flickering across his cheekbone. He darted his eyes around the room, searching for an ally, a nod of reassurance, but found only bowed heads from the jury and stunned stares from the audience. Malik stood steady under the cold glare of the fluorescent lights, their harsh glow bathing his thin shoulders like some faded spotlight. No anger flared in his expression, no smug triumph curved his lips. He simply turned his gaze toward Judge Hayes, then to the jury, his voice low and steady, cutting through the suffocating air with unshakable clarity. The car wasn't stolen. He paused, letting the words settle, each syllable rolling across the courtroom floor and bouncing back from every shadowed nook. It was borrowed by the owner's nephew. But no one told that to the police. And because of that silence, I, a teenager, got dragged into this courtroom like a criminal. The room froze solid. In that instant, time itself seemed to halt under the weight of his revelation. A few jurors exchanged glances, their minds visibly rewinding through the case, recalculating every assumption. A female reporter lowered her pen, her head snapping up, lips parting as she mouthed a stunned whisper. What the hell is happening here? Malik didn't need to elaborate. The truth stood bare, piercing through not with emotion, but with cold, hard reason. He'd exposed a linchpin no one had bothered to examine. A tiny oversight, an accidental silence, could hurl an innocent person into the abyss of prejudice beneath the unforgiving blade of the law, within a system that only heard what it wanted to hear. As he stepped back to his place, retreating with the same quiet resolve, something shifted irrevocably. The ones who'd snickered, shaken their heads, past judgment, stopped seeing Malik as a kid playing at being a lawyer. Now he loomed as a genuine threat, a living challenge to a system so accustomed to being wrong without ever facing scrutiny. The air grew heavier still, not with disdain, but with the dawning unease of those who realized they might have underestimated him. And the cost of that mistake was only beginning to unfold. The taut air in the courtroom, still vibrating from the shock wave of Gerald Whitaker's testimony, had barely begun to settle when Edwin Blake, driven by the instincts of a man who never tolerated losing ground, sprang to his feet. His face betrayed a lingering strain, but his voice slid back into that practiced calm, a veneer of control he wore like armor. "Your Honor," Blake declared, lifting a small USB drive from his stack of files with a flourish. The prosecution requests to present video evidence from a security camera near the scene. This footage, while not pristine, clearly shows the defendant, Malik Carter, approaching and entering the vehicle reported stolen. A uniformed officer stepped forward, plugging the device into the large screen mounted on the courtroom sidewall. The room dimmed instantly, the faint, eerie glow from the lone screen casting an otherworldly sheen over the space, transforming it into something surreal, almost dreamlike. Every pair of eyes locked onto the flickering image as it stuttered to life, a grainy, black and white feed from a high-angle security camera. Its quality was poor, the timestamp in the corner blinking erratically. In the video, a figure, tall, lean, moved slowly toward a sedan parked tight against the curb. The person glanced around, then bent low, popped the door open with unsettling ease, and slipped into the driver's seat. The entire sequence unfolded in less than 10 seconds. No face was discernible, no sound accompanied the motion, no distinguishing feature stood out beyond a shadowy silhouette in a dark jacket and jeans. Blake folded his arms, planting himself in front of the screen before turning to address the room with a booming finality. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence speaks for itself. The individual in this video matches the defendant's description perfectly. Same lean build, same height, same clothing, remarkably consistent with what Mr. Carter was wearing when apprehended." Malik remained still, his notebook untouched, his gaze unswerving. He stared at the video, eyes unblinking, absorbing every frame. Then, after a few beats, he rose and stepped into the center of the room. His movements were slow but resolute, each step a measured tread along the razor's edge between truth and ruin. He fixed his eyes on Investigator Foster, the man who'd submitted the footage. "Mr. Foster," Malik began, his voice cutting through the dim haze of the room, steady and clear. In this video, can you confirm the face of the person entering the car? Foster hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before he shook his head. No, the footage is too blurry. The camera didn't capture facial details. So, how do you identify that person as me? Malik pressed, his tone even, unyielding. Based on the build, the height, and the clothing, Foster replied, his voice firm but tinged with a defensive edge. They align with the description from your arrest. Malik gave a slight nod, then turned back to his table. He plucked a color printout from his stack, a still from the video, zoomed in as far as clarity allowed, capturing the moment the figure entered the car, and held it aloft for the jury to see. Your Honor, he said, his hands steady, his eyes never leaving the photo. This is the image, enhanced to the best possible extent. You'll notice no face, no defining mark, no clear indicator of identity. Just a shadow, a shape, something that could belong to anyone with a similar height and build as me. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on the jurors, the gallery, the judge. And if a silhouette alone is enough to convict, then hundreds, thousands of innocent people could be condemned every single day. The room froze, the air turning brittle, as if one wrong move might shatter it entirely. A woman in the jury, 50-something, gray streaks threading her hair, her frame slight, lifted a trembling hand to her mouth. A single tear slipped down her cheek, silent and unbidden. She'd once been the mother of a boy convicted on equally murky footage, a wound that had never healed. Now, that old pain roared back to life in a way she hadn't braced for. Malik stepped back, placing the photo on the evidence table with quiet precision, then returned to his seat. The courtroom remained hushed, a stunned silence gripping every corner. Even Blake, poised to strike, held back, his usual quick retort stilled on his tongue. Because with each passing second, that video, meant to be the prosecution's killing blow, morphed into a mirror, reflecting the perilous flaw of a system too eager to judge, too quick to see what it wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The atmosphere in the courtroom hung taut, a wire stretched to its breaking point, quivering with every breath. Each of Malik's rebuttals had been a precise incision, slicing through the layers of blind faith in a system everyone assumed was unbreakable. And now the moment had arrived for him to play his final card, a move in a meticulously crafted counterattack that had been brewing beneath his calm exterior. Malik rose to his feet, his gaze locking onto the judge's bench with unwavering resolve. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady and clear. I'd like to call my next witness, Jordan Whitaker. The side door creaked open, and a young man stepped into the room. Jordan, around 20, tall but visibly awkward, shuffled forward in a dark hoodie, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He passed Mrs. Caroline without meeting her eyes, while Mr. Gerald kept his head bowed, avoiding the scene entirely. The room grew heavier, not with the icy detachment of the trial's start, but with the electric hum of something on the verge of unraveling. Malik didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice cut straight to the core, sharp and unyielding. Jordan, on the night of March 14th, did you borrow your Uncle Gerald Whitaker's car? Yes, Jordan nodded, his voice trembling slightly. I borrowed it to go see my girlfriend. And what happened after that? I parked it near her place. Thought I'd only be a few minutes, but we got into a fight. I walked off, left it there. When I came back the next morning, the car was gone. Did you report it to the police? Jordan bit his lip, his head dipping lower. No, I was scared I'd get yelled at, scared my uncle would flip out. So, I didn't tell anyone. A faint sigh rippled through the gallery, a mix of frustration and reluctant empathy. A childish mistake, a very real fear, but also the spark that had sent the entire legal system chasing the wrong target for weeks. Malik nodded, taking a step closer, his focus narrowing like a laser. When you returned the next morning, did you see anyone around the car? Jordan hesitated, his brow furrowing as he dredged up the memory. Yeah, there was this guy, wearing a cap, gray jacket, standing nearby. He wasn't getting in the car, just staring at it. Then he started walking toward me. Looked sketchy, you know? You're sure? Positive. He freaked me out, just standing there. Malik pivoted toward the judge, his voice still even, but now carrying a weight that struck like a hammer. Your Honor, the man Jordan just described, the one in the cap and gray jacket who approached the car, was Officer Raymond Knox. A shock wave tore through the room. Eyes snapped from Malik to Knox, whose face flushed a deep crimson, his lips pressing into a tight, furious line. Malik didn't wait for the stunned silence to settle. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing like twin torches. Officer Knox was in plain clothes, no badge visible, no police ID shown. And he approached me out of nowhere on a dark, empty street. As a black teenager, suddenly confronted by a strange man in a quiet neighborhood at night, I didn't run because I was guilty. I ran because I thought I was about to be robbed, or worse. A sharp gasp escaped a woman in the gallery. A man exhaled heavily, the sound rough with dawning realization, a truth the trial had overlooked until now. The primal fear of a kid targeted not for what he'd done, but for who he was. Malik turned to the jury, his gaze no longer uncertain, but piercing with raw, unfiltered honesty. I didn't run from the police. I ran to save my life. The silence that followed stretched long and unbroken. No one spoke. Even Judge Hayes couldn't mask the flicker of unease in her eyes. In that suspended moment, what had once been deemed ironclad evidence crumbled into a pile of missteps, a spiraling mess of misunderstandings, oversights, and perilous prejudice. Malik wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing a machine too accustomed to convicting before it listened. And now, at last, the room, every last soul in it, was finally starting to hear him. No one in the courtroom uttered a word as Malik rose again. The mocking laughter had died. The whispers faded. The scratch of pens stilled, replaced by an absolute, deafening silence. It wasn't the silence of skepticism anymore. It was the hush of a room that knew something truly momentous was about to unfold. Malik stepped toward the witness stand, guided by the court clerk to take the oath. He raised his right hand, his left pressed against his chest where his heart pounded like a war drum. But his eyes burned with a quiet, unyielding resolve. His voice broke the stillness, not booming or polished, but raw and achingly real. I didn't run from justice. I ran from the shadow this society's been shoving into my head my whole life. The room remained frozen. No one stirred, no one coughed. Malik swallowed hard, his hands clasping tightly in front of him. I was born in a neighborhood they call the sin zone. But my mom, she was the only light in that darkness. She worked 2 jobs every day. She used to tell me, "You don't need to be rich, just don't let anyone steal the truth inside you." His voice caught, faltering for a heartbeat, 1 second, 2, then pressed on. When I was 12, she died of a stroke. No one helped. The ambulance came late. They said that's just how it goes in that area. Then it was my brother's turn, forced to take a plea because he had no lawyer, no bail money. I watched him get locked up for 3 years, just because they needed someone to pin it on. Malik lifted his head, his eyes glistening but refusing to spill over. I thought if I stayed good, studied hard, I'd get treated fairly. But no one believed me. No one helped me. When I got arrested, they treated me like a criminal before they even asked my name. I sat in a filthy cell for 3 days because I had no one to bail me out. No one. A juror, a woman with gray hair, raised a trembling hand to wipe a tear. A young reporter bowed her head, scribbling furiously as her hand shook. Judge Hayes, for the first time since the trial began, set her pen down and sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly in front of her, as if struggling to hold herself together. Malik drew a deep breath, his voice slowed, steady now, carrying a strength no one could interrupt. I didn't learn law in a classroom. I learned it because I had to. I learned it because if I didn't, I'd drown in a system that doesn't see me as human. I learned it because I want to survive. He turned to the jury, his gaze open, gentle but unflinching. I'm not here to win. I'm here to live. And to prove we can't keep pretending this is normal. A stifled sob broke from the back of the room. A man dropped his head into his hands. The jurors no longer sat like stone statues. The room had transformed, not because the law had shifted, but because a boy had dared to step into the heart of a world not built for him and spoke the truth. And that truth, with all its pain, its helplessness, its fragile hope, no longer rested in the system's grip. It now lived in the hearts of those sitting silently before him, raw and undeniable. The courtroom was steeped in a silence no one dared to break. After everything that had unfolded, the accusations, the rebuttals, the tears, and those suffocating stretches of quiet every eye now fixed on a single figure, the jury foreman. A gray-haired man with a stern face but eyes heavy with contemplation. He rose, his hand trembling slightly as it clutched the verdict paper. Judge Hayes spoke, her voice steady but stripped of its usual haughty edge. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" He nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We have reached a consensus." The room seemed to hold its breath. "On the charge of grand theft auto, we find the defendant not guilty." A wave of emotion rippled through the gallery, but he wasn't done. "On the charge of resisting an officer, we also find the defendant not guilty." Malik stood still. No cheers, no fist-pumping, no shouts. He just stood there, head bowed, hands cradling his face as if to hold on to the truth that had just been acknowledged, a truth he'd fought alone to bring into the light. Tears streamed down his cheeks, not out of triumph, but because for the first time in his life, the legal system had admitted he wasn't wrong. Judge Hayes, who'd eyed him with skepticism from the start, now looked up at Malik with a wholly different expression. She stood, her voice lowering, not in reprimand, but in a rare sincerity she seldom offered a defendant. "Malik Carter, you've made me rethink a lot of things. Not just this case, but how we, as people with power, have sometimes overlooked the most important thing: listening." She paused, her gaze no longer that of a cold enforcer of the law, but of someone who learned a hard-earned lesson from the very boy she'd once dismissed. "You taught me something today, and I hope you don't stop. Keep going down this path. Become a defender of justice. The world needs people like you." Malik didn't respond. He just nodded, tears still falling, but his eyes now gleamed with a light no verdict could extinguish: hope. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun cast a gentle glow over the cold stone steps as the door swung open. Jordan rushed forward, his face etched with regret. No long explanation needed. He pulled Malik into a tight hug, choking out, "I'm sorry. My silence. It almost destroyed you." Malik gripped Jordan's shoulder, no trace of blame in him. He just said, soft but sharp as a blade, "We're all victims. But from now on, we won't stay silent." They let go, but that didn't matter anymore, because in that moment, the truth had found its voice. And it didn't just speak for Malik. It spoke for everyone who'd ever been buried under prejudice, power, and indifference. Hours later, as the media swarmed over the trial's outcome, a reporter asked Judge Hayes if she had anything to say about this extraordinary case. She offered just one line, simple but seismic enough to rattle the legal world: "If a kid can defend himself against the whole system, that says more about the system than it does about the kid." And that statement echoed louder than any ruling in that courtroom. Because it wasn't just Malik's vindication, it was a wake-up call for an entire society. If you are inspired by stories with unexpected twists, moral challenges, and the impact of kindness, please support us by liking or subscribing to Emotional Journey. We put our heart and soul into each narrative.